Hey everyone, and welcome to today's talk on hormones and their effect on behavior. And we're going to be specifically focusing not only on all hormones, but specifically on cortisol and how it affects behavior, looking at two studies. All right, here we go. So hormones are the body's chemical messengers. Some are secreted in endocrine glands throughout the body, and some are secreted by organs such as the intestines or the brain. Hormones travel to specific target tissues throughout the bloodstream that could affect behavior. And they are chemicals produced by glandular cells or from glands as part of this endocrine system. Cells communicate by chemical secretions in the body. They are not externally secreted like we saw with pheromones. But glands secrete these hormones directly into the bloodstream where they are carried to all parts of the body. Because it takes longer to circulate throughout the bloodstream, it takes longer to potentially change behavior. And it could be from minutes to weeks or longer before the response occurs. Though it takes longer, the effects of the hormones are often longer lasting than neural controlled effects. And what we mean by that are neurotransmitters, as we talked before. So neural responses and hormones are not competitive, but complementary. Sometimes neurotransmitters where it will help the job of hormones and also communicate to hormones or to glands to secrete those hormones, to release those hormones. And then the endocrine system and nervous system directly interact, so the differences between neurotransmitters and hormones are not so simple. So for instance, the first example here is that the pituitary gland regulates other glands while also being directly connected to the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus also releases small amounts of hormones which affect the endocrine system. So the neural system or the nervous system and the endocrine system interact in this way. And then cortisol hormone cooperates with adrenaline or epinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter. And in talking about how they affect behavior, there's a few ways that they do so. So the first is mood. They also contribute to depressive symptoms, sexual reproduction, like testosterone, those are hormones, fight or flight, and then affecting appetite related to obesity as well. They can also affect behavior temporarily or permanently. So for instance, stress hormones can, in the short term, cause students to forget what they studied when cramming, but in the long term, they kill off brain cells in the hippocampus, which we talked about was connected to new memories and the creation of new memories. And so they can affect us short term and long term. And too much or too little of a hormone as regulated by the body can affect behavior as well, to the point that even small differences can make a huge difference, like cortisol, like testosterone, like progesterone, all these different places. All right, in terms of the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters then, because they're both chemicals within our body, hormones are not as swift as neurotransmissions to impact behavior. Hormone effects are often longer lasting than the neural controlled responses. And we talked about this a few slides ago, but again, they don't act in seconds like they do for neurotransmitters. And then again, the fact that the two systems interact makes acknowledging differences between the two even more difficult. And also the last major difference, neurotransmitters release in the synapses, hormones release in the bloodstream. So neurotransmitters are more controlled to the nervous system. Hormones go throughout the body within the bloodstream. There's a few hormones that are also neurotransmitters as well. Norepinephrine, the first one, or noradrenaline. These are secretion of the adrenal glands, which is also found in much of the nervous system as a neurotransmitter. Adrenaline or epinephrine is also a secretion of the adrenal glands. instantaneously affecting mood and attention. And then vasopressin as well influences blood pressure as a hormone, but then it's found in the hypothalamus as a neurotransmitter affecting memory and learning. Now, as far as neuropeptides go, this is based on the idea that some chemicals influence neurotransmission while retaining their role as hormones, and these are known as neuropeptides. And these have further influenced us in terms of how we think about how the body functions in a more integrative way. It's not like each part is acting on its own where it only has that specific function and it doesn't have to talk about, or talk to, I should say, other parts of the body or communicate with them. And so, for instance, endorphins are a neuropeptide. They enhance our mood and reduce pain, and they influence neural transmission while also becoming being a hormone for us. So the main hormone we're going to be talking about today is cortisol. And we've talked about the role of stress in our bodies before, but cortisol is specifically produced to help us overcome the effects of stress. And for that reason, it is the most important glucocorticoid. And steroid hormones are produced by the adrenal cortex and then released in response to stress. And so when we think about how cortisol acts, it acts in a similar way to epinephrine, which is adrenaline. It often acts as a neurotransmitter and hormone, helping the body to overcome the relative effects of stress on our body. And so epinephrine, when our body goes into a stressful situation, acts within seconds of someone perceiving a stressor. And then cortisol comes in to back up the action after minutes and hours of the person being in a stressful situation. Epinephrine is part of the sympathetic nervous system. And this is the autonomic system within that nervous system produces epinephrine right away as to deal with a stressor in such situations as fight or flight. And then again, cortisol comes in to back it up. If cortisol is in action too much, that tells you that the body is in a stressful situation for a long time. And as we've mentioned before, this can lead to a whole host of issues with memory, with blood pressure, with the basic functioning of the body, both in the short term and in the long term. And so cortisol really affects the body if it's in place for too long and if it's released for too long. It ends up shutting down reproduction and immunity. This is because your body wants to deal with the stress, wants to deal with the threat that is around it. And so all energy is channeled into handling the stressor for things that are not immediately concerning our survival. Now, in terms of the processes that the body goes through, there is this idea of homeostasis versus allostasis. The first one, homeostasis, self-regulation of the body to keep the body system in stable state. Cortisol is part of that strategy to try and calm down the body, to try and overcome the effects of stress on the body. But allostasis means to return to stability. Originally, we thought that homeostasis was where our body would sort of be in a state of stability most of the time. However, what we found is that allostasis is more likely what is happening. Returning to stability or trying to return to stability is more common than actually being in a stable state. And cortisol and epinephrine are used to aid in those processes. In terms of the system through which our body goes to respond to stress, there is a stress response system called the HPA axis. And this includes 3 different parts of our body: the hypothalamus in the brain, the pituitary gland, and then the adrenal cortex as well. Unfortunately, though, most of us have the HPA axis activated for most of the time, far more than we should in order to lead a healthy, normal life with as little stress as possible. This has been linked to health issues like heart attacks, high blood pressure, cholesterol, but also memory issues. And it can suppress the immunity if activated for over an hour. If you are in stress consistently too long, you are more likely to have health issues. So we skipped over that last question, but just in terms of how the HPA axis works, the stressor first activates the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus sends the message to the pituitary gland to produce hormones, and then it sends a message to the adrenal glands to produce cortisol to come in and back up the stressors in action. So our first study here is going to study the effects of certain stressors on cortisol and later immunity. So the aim of the study was to ask the question, do particular types of stressors increase the risk of catching a cold? So they had a sample of 125 men, 151 women, ages 18 to 55, producing a span of ages there. But they paid people $800. And we're going to talk about that in a second in terms of how that's a potential limitation of this study. So the procedure were that participants were interviewed first about their social networks, education, diet, health practices after getting a checkup to make sure that they were healthy. And this is asking a whole bunch of issues about their experience and their life, leading us to think about the sociocultural perspective as well when considering this study. So there were life stress interviews asked about employment, relationships, finances, social networks, like we talked about before, and then the participants were quarantined. Everyone in this study were given nasal drops with a low infectious dose of 2 cold viruses, and the quarantine lasted for 5 days after exposure and required everyone to stay 3 feet away from others when interacting. Given what we know about the coronavirus now, we could think about whether 3 feet was a large enough distance away from others when interacting. So the quarantine ended, but the study lasted for about 28 days to see if anyone developed a cold. And 8 different factors were controlled for: age, gender, education level. Even the quarantine was designed to make sure that people were not getting sick because they were just around other people, that it was due to the nasal drops that they were given. So the results, the stressors lasting 1 month or longer for individuals, things like marriage or work, things that are going to last longer than a month, were often more important than short-term stressors. The longer that a stressor lasted, necessitating a need for cortisol, the greater the risk of illness. And relationship difficulties and job problems, again, contributed the most to stress. The risk for catching a cold was often related to higher levels of stress hormones. And so this hormone of cortisol, which is coming into place for the minutes and hours after a stressful event has occurred, is sort of taxing the body. And so a few evaluations of this: is paying subjects changing their motivation and their answers to questions? Are they more likely to exaggerate certain answers for more extreme or more reduced answers based on what they think the researchers want to hear? And that's why it's a question of ethics, it's a question of validity, whether or not to pay subjects. Also, does the time of year impact the likelihood of them getting sick? If this is done in winter, I would say there's more possible variables that may confound the study. And then also the last question here: is it ethical to make people sick for scientific study? Is the worth of us finding out more about the effects of cortisol worth them getting this cold? And so all things that need to be considered in the study. And just a question for you to consider: is 800 enough for you to get sick? I know there's been certain colds I've had where you could have paid me $1 million, and I don't think I would have agreed to get sick. Well, maybe $1 million. Maybe I've just exaggerated answer here. All right, the last study we're going to look at today is Fernald and Gunnar from 2009. And the aim of the study was to investigate the extent to which participation in a poverty alleviation program affected the levels of cortisol in young, impoverished children. And poverty is a stressful event. If you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, if certain things are not provided for you, if certain social structures are not provided for you because of the resources of the family, that's going to affect the stress levels. If your parents are fighting over money, that affects your stress levels. And so that's why they wanted to study this effect on cortisol. So the participants for this, samples of families living in rural Mexico chosen as the target population, and each family had to have at least one child between the ages of 2 and 6. So in this program, 554 children were in this experimental oportunidades program. Sorry, I did not learn Spanish in school. And 762 children there in a control condition, and the mean age was 13.9 months. So the procedure, they took a team of researchers to visit the family. They had a 1-hour interview with the mother. They were assessed on a depression inventory to see how they interacted in the home. If the mother was depressed, that may have led more to her being unresponsive to the needs of the children, stuff like that, that could have impacted their stress levels. 25 to 40 minutes of a cognitive test were administered to the children as well, and the cortisol levels were measured via saliva samples at 3 specific time points within the study over the course of 1 day. So the results, the children who had been participating in the program showed lower salivary cortisol levels. So they showed lower levels of cortisol in their saliva than children in the control group who did not have access to the program, who were just sort of left on their own. The program showed significant effects on children with intensely depressed mothers, but not to the same extent on children of less depressed mothers. And so if you were in the control group and you had a mother who was not depressed, who was providing you with emotional support to a greater level, most likely, then the effects of the program were not as significant. You were already getting what some of what the program was going to provide. And so the conclusion was that participation in a poverty alleviation program, alleviating the effects of poverty, can have significantly positive impacts on stress levels, particularly for children who have intensely depressed mothers. And so parenting matters in the stress felt over factors of resources like low socioeconomic status. So in terms of looking at the strengths and limitations of this study, the strengths were that the researchers were careful to ensure that they were not confounding variables. They increasing children's stress by appearing without warning at their family home. The children always knew when the researchers were going to show up. They also spent time with the children prior to testing to get them more used to the environment, the test, not as scary, which wouldn't raise cortisol levels, or they would at least control for that. Also, it was large-scale real-life measurements showing high ecological validity, which is great. The limitations: using a depression inventory to assess the degree of depression in the mothers does not necessarily give a full and detailed insight into the exact nature of the emotional states. They may have other factors that may contribute to higher cortisol levels in the children. And then also the positive effects of a poverty alleviation program are only apparent for intensely depressed mothers. Then what strategy might work for those with mild depression, or those that might become worse over time, or even in poverty alleviation programs where the mother is providing, or the father is providing, a stable emotional home environment. And so this may lessen the usefulness of the research. All right, that is it for today as far as our talks about hormones and behavior. If you have questions, as always, please reach out to me and let me know. Have a great day.